Shrimp fork hit the tablecloth about 6 inches from my hand, not thrown. Not exactly, more like placed down hard, the way my sister did things when she wanted everyone to notice without being accused of anything. She had a talent for that. "Abby, can you grab another breadbasket from the kitchen?" she said. Not asked, said. The way you'd speak to someone who worked there. I was a guest at that dinner table. I had flown in from DC that morning. I had a 6 a.m. flight back the next day, and I was being asked to fetch bread. I got up and got the bread. My name is Abigail Hartwell. Most people who matter call me Abby. The ones who mattered most to my career, for a long time, called me Dr. Hartwell. I'm 31 years old, and I have spent the better part of the last 7 years working for the federal government in a capacity I was not allowed to discuss at family dinners. Not because it was classified. Well, not entirely. Mostly because no one ever asked. My older sister, Renee, married well. That's how my mother always said it. Renee married well, with this particular exhale that made everything that followed in the sentence unnecessary. Her husband, Clint, had built a regional logistics company from scratch and sold it in his late 30s for something in the range of $30 million. They lived in a house in Scottsdale with a guest wing. They had a Sonos system in every room. They had opinions about wine. I had a studio apartment in Foggy Bottom, a Metro card, and a government laptop I was not allowed to take into certain buildings. At family events, this contrast was never spoken about directly. It was handled through implication, through who got asked to help in the kitchen, through who got asked for advice on financial decisions versus who got asked how the government job was going, with that particular pause before the word government that communicated everything. My father had passed 4 years earlier. After that, Renee's house became the gathering point. Thanksgiving, Christmas, the occasional birthday dinner that somehow always felt like an audition for something I hadn't applied for. This particular dinner was for my mother's 65th birthday. I had known, flying out, that the weekend would be what it always was. Renee would organize everything and then mention 12 times that she had organized everything. Clint would hold court at the head of the table even though it was my mother's birthday. The cousins would be there. Renee's side of the family, mostly, people who knew me as Renee's younger sister, the one who works for the government, never married. What a shame. I had prepared myself for it the way I always did. I kept my expectations at the floor and my responses short. What I had not prepared for was Dexter Calloway. He sat to Clint's left, introduced before dinner as a potential business partner, something about a distribution deal Clint was considering. He was polished in the way that money makes people polished. Blazer with no tie. Watch that cost more than my rent. The kind of handshake that was also an assessment. He was pleasant to everyone at the table. He was pleasant to me in the way that people are pleasant to furniture, acknowledging I was there without actually registering me. Dinner was catered. Renee had hired a small company that specialized in Mediterranean-style spreads, which meant there were a lot of small plates and not a lot of clear instructions about what to do with them. I ended up being the one who figured out the serving order. I ended up being the one who refilled the water glasses when the hired help disappeared into the kitchen. I ended up being the one who quietly handled the thing when my mother's dress snagged on her chair and she was embarrassed. I just did it. I have always just done it. Renee called it my caretaker complex when she was feeling analytical. She called it other things when she wasn't. She's always been like this, Renee said at some point during the second course, addressing Dex the way you'd explain a quirky decoration in your house. Abby just hovers. She can't help it. Even when we were kids, she was always the one making sure everyone had enough napkins. A few people smiled. My mother looked at her plate. I refilled Dex's water glass and said nothing. "What is it you do, Abby?" Dex asked, not unkindly. The question felt genuine. Or maybe I wanted it to feel genuine. "I work for a federal agency," I said. "Which one?" "One of the boring ones," I said and smiled and moved to refill someone else's glass. Renee laughed. She's being modest. She processes grant applications. For, like, public health initiatives. Processes grant applications. For, like, public health initiatives. Very important work. She said it the way you'd say a child's drawing was very beautiful. I did not process grant applications. I had not processed grant applications since I was 24 years old, but I had stopped correcting Renee on this approximately 3 years prior because the correction always led to a conversation I did not want to have at the dinner table, and I had gotten very good at choosing my battles. I carried the bread basket back to the kitchen and stood at the counter for a moment, just breathing. The kitchen smelled like garlic and lemon. There was a small television mounted under the cabinet that the catering staff had muted. I watched the silent news crawl for a few seconds and then picked up the new basket and went back out. Here is what my family knew about my career. Accurately, I had a PhD in public health policy from Johns Hopkins. I'd started with the Department of Health and Human Services at 24, entry level, doing exactly what Renee described. I had moved up through several positions over the years. I currently worked in Washington. Here is what my family had filled in inaccurately and then calcified into fact through repetition: that I had plateaued, that I was a mid-level bureaucrat, that I was in the family taxonomy the less successful sister, bright enough, steady enough, but ultimately someone who had chosen safety over ambition, someone who would always be more comfortable in a supporting role. They were not cruel people. I want to be clear about that. They loved me in the way that people love someone they have fundamentally misread, with warmth and with a complete absence of curiosity. My father had been different. My father had pushed me, asked questions, sat across from me at his kitchen table when I was still in grad school and said, "Tell me what you're actually working on, not the version you think I'll understand." He had been proud of me in a way that didn't require explanation. When he died, that particular kind of attention went with him. After that, I found it easier to just let people believe whatever they already believed. The dinner moved through its courses. My mother seemed happy in the distracted way she'd been happy since my father passed, genuinely pleased by the surface of things, careful not to look too deeply. Renee kept the conversation moving. Clint told a long story about a golf trip that ended with a punchline I didn't understand and everyone laughed at anyway. Dex was good company. I noticed that grudgingly. He listened well, which is rarer than people think. He asked follow-up questions. He didn't talk over anyone except Clint, and that was only because Clint talked over everyone, so you either joined that rhythm or disappeared from the conversation entirely. At one point, he turned to me again. "You said you work for a federal agency," he said. "Which one, actually?" "You deflected earlier." "Did I?" I said. "Gracefully," he said. "But yes." I looked at him. He had dark eyes and something careful in them. "Not suspicious, just attentive. As PR," I said. He paused. "The Administration for Strategic Preparedness and Response." I nodded. He paused again. Longer this time. Something shifted slightly in the way he was sitting. "What's your role there?" he asked, and his voice had changed in a way that was almost imperceptible. "I'm a senior official," I said. And then, because I was tired and because it was my mother's 65th birthday and I had fetched 2 bread baskets and refilled 6 water glasses and I was just tired, Deputy Assistant Secretary, currently. The table was mid-conversation on 3 other tracks. No one heard this exchange except X. He looked at me for a long moment. "I'm sorry," he said. "I think I owe you an apology for earlier." I didn't know what he meant yet. I would understand later. The evening wound down the way these things do. My mother cut the cake and cried a little, which was appropriate. Renee gave a toast that was mostly about herself but had good intentions. Clint offered everyone a tour of the new outdoor kitchen, which several people took him up on. I was helping stack the dessert plates when Dex came to stand beside me. "Callaway Logistics," he said, quietly. "Clint's prospective deal." "Okay," I said. "My company is the other party." He paused. "I came here tonight expecting a casual dinner. I looked you up when you went to get the bread the second time." I set down the plates. "The response coordination protocols," he said, "for the 2022 supply chain emergency. Those came out of your office." I didn't confirm or deny. Professional habit. "I used those protocols," he said. "My entire distribution network ran on the framework your team built. We kept our contracts through the disruption because of that framework." He paused. "I had no idea. I've been sitting here watching you refill water glasses." "Someone has to," I said. He didn't smile. He looked at me with something I hadn't expected from anyone at that table. He looked at me with respect. "I should tell you what ASPR actually does, because most people don't know, and that's not their fault. The Administration for Strategic Preparedness and Response sits under the Department of Health and Human Services. It exists to make sure the country has a functional plan when things go wrong: pandemics, disasters, supply chain failures, The kind of cascading emergencies that don't fit neatly into any one agency's jurisdiction. It coordinates across federal departments, state governments, private sector partners. It is by design invisible when it works. I had been with the agency for 7 years. I had been in my current role for 11 months. Before that, I had spent 2 years on a joint task force that I still couldn't talk about in detail. Before that, I had led the policy division through a period that my colleagues referred to simply as the bad years, and which had added approximately 17 gray hairs to my head that I had since learned to accept. I was 31 years old and I had been in rooms where decisions were made that affected the health infrastructure of the entire country, and I had gone home afterward and microwaved soup and watched British baking shows and called my mother on Sundays. I had not told my family any of this because it never seemed like the right moment, and then it became a habit, and then the habit became a wall, and at some point I stopped trying to find the door. I went to sleep that night in Renee's guest wing, in a room with a very white duvet and a diffuser running something that smelled like eucalyptus, and I stared at the ceiling and felt the particular exhaustion of having been seen by the wrong person and not seen by the right ones. In the morning, I came down early. Renee was already in the kitchen, coffee made, laptop open. She was in her element at 6 in the morning in her own house. I have always admired that about her, even when it annoyed me. Dex seems interesting, I said, pouring coffee. He's been good for Clint Steele, Renee said, not looking up. Very sharp. He mentioned the emergency protocols. From 2022, Renee glanced up briefly. What about them? He said his company used them. Oh. She looked back at her screen. That's good. I'm glad the government stuff was useful. I drank my coffee. Renee, I said. I'm the Deputy Assistant Secretary at ASPR. She looked up again. I know, babe. I said that. You said I process grant applications. She made a face. I was simplifying. I oversee a division that coordinates national emergency health response, I said. I have a staff of 47 people. I brief Congress. I was on a task force for 2 years that. I stopped. I'm not a paper pusher, Renee. She was quiet for a moment. Why didn't you ever say that? She asked. And she sounded genuinely confused, which somehow made it worse. Because every time I tried, you explained my own job to me. The kitchen was very quiet. I didn't know, she said finally. I know you didn't, I said. And I meant it without anger. That was the strangest part. I meant it without any anger at all. That's why I'm telling you. I got my bag and took the rideshare to the airport. Renee stood at the door and watched me go with an expression I didn't know how to read. Not guilt, exactly. Something more like recalibration. Like she was looking at a map she'd thought she had memorized and finding a road that shouldn't have been there. At the airport, I bought a coffee and a bottle of water and found my gate and sat down. My phone buzzed. A number I didn't recognize. Dr. Hartwell, this is Dex Calloway. I hope it's all right that Clint gave me your number. I'd like to speak with you professionally when you're back in DC, if you're open to it. What your office built in 22, we've been doing it wrong. I'd like to understand how to do it right. And I'd like to apologize again for last night more properly. I read it twice. Then I put my phone away and watched the planes through the gate window for a while. There is a particular kind of invisibility that gets built slowly over years by people who love you. It doesn't happen all at once. It starts with the simplification. She processes grants, and then the simplification gets repeated until it replaces the truth, and then the replacement becomes so established that everyone, including you, sometimes begins to move around it like it's solid. Like it's the wall and not a mistake. My father used to say that a person's real life happens mostly off stage, that the parts that matter are the parts no one witnesses. He said it as a comfort, I think. He said it in the context of me being frustrated as a teenager, that no one seemed to see the version of me I thought was real. He was right, but he missed something. The offstage life still needs a witness eventually, not for approval, not to prove anything. Just because a life lived entirely in private starts to feel theoretical, starts to feel like it could be taken back. Like you might have imagined the whole thing. I replied to Dex 2 days later from my desk in Foggy Bottom. We scheduled a call for the following Thursday. It was professional and brief and went well. My mother called me that Sunday, the way she always did. We talked for 20 minutes about the birthday dinner and the catering and how the cake had been slightly dry but the gesture was wonderful. At the end, just before we hung up, she said, "Renee told me about your job, your actual job." I said, "Yeah." She was quiet for a moment. "I should have asked more questions," she said, "when you were coming up. I should have asked better questions." "Dad asked good questions," I said. "He always knew what to ask," she said. And then she cried, briefly, and I let her. And I didn't fill the silence because some silences are doing something important, and you learn to recognize them. "I'm proud of you," she said. "I just want you to know I always was, even when I didn't know what I was proud of." Does that make sense? It made more sense than I expected. "Yeah, Mom," I said. "It does." Renee texted me the following Tuesday. No preamble. "I looked up ASPR. I looked up your name. There's a congressional testimony from last year." I waited. "You testified for 45 minutes and 3 senators thanked you by name at the end." I didn't respond right away. I was in a meeting. When I got out, I typed back, "Did you watch it?" She replied, "All 45 minutes. And then, after a pause, "You were incredible, Abby. Why didn't you tell us?" I looked at my phone for a long time before I answered. I thought about the bread baskets and the water glasses and the shrimp fork placed hard on the tablecloth. I thought about she processes grants said to a man whose logistics network I had indirectly helped keep operational through one of the worst supply chain crises in recent memory. I thought about my father's kitchen table and "Tell me what you're actually working on." I typed, "I tried. A few times. I'll try better." She sent back a single emoji, a heart. Then, "Come back for Christmas. Actually come back. And this time, sit down. I will go back for Christmas. I already know I will. Not because things are fixed. They aren't, entirely. Not because I think one conversation or one Tuesday text exchange rewrites 7 years of a particular family dynamic. It doesn't. That's not how any of this works. But I have learned, slowly and not without cost, that the truth doesn't need to announce itself dramatically to be true. It doesn't need a spotlight or a prepared statement. It just needs to be said, plainly, at a kitchen table in the early morning with coffee going cold, to someone who has loved you imperfectly and is finally ready to listen. I still pick up the napkins. I will probably always pick up the napkins. Not because no one sees me doing it, but because someone has to, and because I have stopped needing the picking up to be the whole story. The rest of the story is in the rooms people don't know I've been in. The decisions made at 3 in the morning when a supply line breaks and 12 states are waiting for a framework that tells them what to do next. The 47 people who show up to my team meetings and push back and make the work better than I could alone. That story doesn't need an audience. It just needed, eventually, a witness. And it found one. 2, if you count my mother crying on the phone. 3, if you count Renee watching 45 minutes of C-SPAN on a Tuesday afternoon. That's enough. For now, that's more than enough. I've thought a lot about why I stayed quiet for so long. Not the polite version of the answer, not "I didn't want to brag" or "it never came up," the real version. The one I only admitted to myself somewhere around 30,000 feet on the flight back to DC, with bad airplane coffee going cold in my hand. I stayed quiet because I had decided, somewhere along the way, that being understood was less important than keeping the peace. That's not humility. I want to be honest about that. Humility is knowing your worth and not needing to perform it. What I was doing was something else, a kind of slow erasure, participated in willingly because the alternative felt like too much effort for too little result. The thing about letting people believe a smaller version of you is that it feels like a sacrifice you're making for them. It feels generous. You're sparing them the discomfort of recalibrating. You're keeping dinner easy. But it isn't generous, not really, it's a trade. You give up being known, and in exchange you get to avoid the specific pain of being seen and still found lacking. It's a hedge, a very sophisticated, very well-dressed hedge. Renee didn't invent the version of me she believed in. I handed it to her, piece by piece, every time I said one of the boring agencies and smiled and moved on. Every time I refilled the water and didn't answer the follow-up question. I built that wall with my own hands and then spent years mildly resentful that no one had climbed it. What changed with Dex wasn't that he was impressive or that his recognition validated me. What changed was something simpler and harder to name. He asked the follow-up question, and I was tired, and I answered it. That's all. No speech, no confrontation. Just one honest sentence at a birthday dinner in Scottsdale, and the whole thing began to come apart at the seams. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not the dramatic version, not the salute, not the moment of public recognition. The quiet part. The Tuesday morning in Renee's kitchen, coffee cooling, laptop open between us, me saying plainly, I'm not a paper pusher. 7 years of a particular dynamic, and it started to shift because I finally said one true thing and didn't immediately soften it. Intelligence without honesty is just performance. I had used my intelligence for years to perform a version of myself that was easier for everyone, including me, to manage. That's not strength. The strength came later, in the kitchen, and the phone call with my mother. In the text I sent Renee that said I tried. I'll try better. The strength was in choosing, finally, to be known rather than comfortable. I still pick up the napkins. I'll tell you that without apology, not because no one else will, but because the picking up was never the problem. The problem was believing the picking up was the whole story. It wasn't. It was just the part that happened in the room. The rest happened in offices and hearing rooms and 3 a.m. Phone calls and documents that will outlast the dinner table they were never mentioned at. That story doesn't require an audience. It just needed, eventually, to be told once, plainly, to the people who love you imperfectly and are, if you give them the chance, capable of doing better. My mother cried when she found out. Not from guilt, I think, from something more honest than that. From the particular grief of realizing you missed something real while you were busy with the surface of things. I understood that grief. I had been living inside a version of it for years. We don't get the time back, but we get what comes after if we're willing to start.